Today, I wanted to build this obstacle, so let's do it!
I started out by drawing the design onto a piece of plywood. This is just the main section that all the other pieces will be attached to. Then I cut it out using a jigsaw. I was then able to trace that onto another piece of plywood and then cut out another one because I want to make two of them. Each sheet of plywood is 3/4 of an inch thick, and I used two of them, meaning this is going to be 1.5 inches thick. I put some glue on them, flipped it over, and then used clamps and screws to hold it together. I came back the next day and was able to cut them out, just tracing along the edge with the jigsaw. Then I went over using the router with the 3/4 inch roundover bit. This cuts down the sharp edges and makes them nice and smooth and makes it not hurt to hold onto them. After I was all done with the main body, I made these sort of bracket pieces. I'm not exactly sure what to call them, but they hold together the two sections of this obstacle. The tricky part about these was making them the right shape that they would cover as much space as possible without interfering with the usability of this obstacle. In the end, I went with this design that still allows me to grab onto the sides of the obstacles rather than just the cliffhangers. Speaking of cliffhangers, I need to make some of those, so I got two pieces of 3/4 inch plywood and then glued them together. I went with the plywood that has a couple more layers, that way it's just a little bit stronger. And while that was drying, I worked on putting a spacer in at the very top. I did this because we need to leave a little bit of a hole that goes through the middle, that way the bar can go through it and the obstacle can spin around that. Then, just to make it look a little bit nicer, I added a cap on the top. Click on my profile to see the rest of the build. To make the cliffhangers, I split the wood down the middle using the table saw set at an angle, that way the cliffhangers would have a slope. Then I quickly went over the edges that I'm going to hold onto with the router, that way it wouldn't have a sharp edge. I cut up these long pieces into shorter ones that will fit the obstacle for what it needs. I used the belt sander to smooth out each of the edges even more. This part's not exactly super fast, it took me around an hour. After I was finally done with sanding, it was time to drill some holes, and I mean a bunch of holes. These are what the bolts are going to go through, and then I had to countersink the heads. Then I had to do that same thing for each of the cliffhangers, so just as many holes as last time, along with countersinking the heads again. Now it was time to get the bolts ready, and I couldn't find the right size of bolts, so I had to cut them a little bit shorter than I could buy. Luckily I have this cool vibrator tool that basically does all the cutting for me. One thing you need to be sure to do is put a nut on the bolt before you cut it, that way after it's done you can kinda clean up the threads. After drilling a few more holes, all I had to do was assemble it, and I put glue on before I put the bolts in, which probably wasn't needed, but it gives it just a little bit more strength. Trying to get all the holes to line up and putting the nuts on was pretty tedious, it took quite a while. Then, because I countersinked both ends, it was pretty tricky to tighten. I had to use one screwdriver and one wrench. I used that method on all 8 cliffhangers, which meant 18 bolts. Now, all there was left to do was to paint them. I went with red and black for the main parts, and then the cliffhangers, I did all of those yellow. This is an example of something that I use this obstacle for. It's definitely the most complicated obstacle I've ever built. Be sure to follow if you want to see more videos like this.